This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic 2 by Matthew J. DiStefano. Ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about faith? In Heretic 2, I dive into LGBTQ affirmation, rejecting divine violence, and embracing universalism in a bold post-Christian perspective. If you're done with outdated dogma and want a justice-oriented, inclusive view of spirituality, then this book is for you. Get Heretic 2 wherever books are sold and start rethinking faith today. This Choircast podcast is brought to you by High Minds. Join host Andy Colenso and Matthew J. DiStefano as they tackle culture, justice, spirituality, and all the big questions shaping our world. High Minds isn't about talking points or hot takes. It's about deep, insightful conversation that inspires and challenges. Tune in to explore new angles, question the status quo, and elevate your thinking. Listen to High Minds wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Radical Love Life, an ongoing series of conversations with thought leaders exploring faith outside the boxes. Hosted by Mark Dilcomb and Kelly Wilson.
Hey,
Kelly.
how are you?
I'm great. I'm freaking awesome as always.
It's so good to hear. It's so good to hear. And today is a great day to be freaking awesome because we are turning 100. I know. We don't look a day over
so
99.
Young. I know. It's amazing. All this face cream has paid off.
Indeed. And I just
Although I have a face for podcast, that's an inside story. So Kelly, enlighten our audience. What do we mean by this 100?
This is our 100th podcast episode. And for those who don't, the whole history of Radical Love Live is we started actually as a live event series in January of 2020. So exactly 5 years ago at the Cathedral St. John the Divine in New York City. And then our podcast was sort of secondary to that, but then when the pandemic
came along,
the podcast became our primary vehicle, but we've produced 100 episodes.
I know. And hasn't it been a joy? It's been a ride and it's been a joy.
It really has. It has. It's interesting to go back and listen to some of the earlier episodes and like how the show has changed and the tone has changed. And I've learned so much from so many different perspectives and so many different guests that we've had along the way and just conversations with one another.
I agree. Quick reflection before we get into the celebration that we have in store here. I can't imagine my faith in the work that I do be where it is today if it wasn't for what we've done here at Radical Love Life and all these conversations we've had with amazing individuals, but exploring it, what faith is. And 5 years on, my faith is so profoundly deeper as a result of these conversations, knowing each time that we have that they've always held up to what we've said is, exploring faith outside of the boxes. And when we are outside of those rules and the dogma and the doctrine, and just really allow people to share what faith means to them and how they celebrate their spirituality and bring it into this. And also have some, we've had some conversations that, a couple like including Andrew Whitehead with his book about, Christian nationalism, and a couple other conversations and things where we've queer affirmation be challenged in some denomination, how people overcome, their own challenges with that or just their own faith. And what a journey we've done here. So, good work, my brother. Good work.
And, one really important thing that I've learned through this process is for years, decades, my faith journey was pretty much a solo journey. Once I did what would now be called deconstruction. At the time, it was just called like backsliding. But that even when I got back into a faith community, when I went back to church, I went back as a sound technician. So I was in my own booth, in my own space, listening to being part of the liturgy, but not really part of the community and a lot of my study and everything. And then making a commitment with a co-creator. And
who was that co-creator, Kelly?
That would be you.
Oh, it was me.
Making a commitment to, and on a journey and having to show up every week really has, I don't know that I would have gone as deep and as broad on this journey just doing something on my own. So it taught me a lot about community, about even just like a community of two, or this kind of community that we're building and have built with the friends of this program and people who come back, how important that is. And I didn't realize that until we got into this. So thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, Kelly. I love you so much, brother.
Helping teach me this. Likewise.
This has been a great journey. And so here we are celebrating our 100th with two.
That's right. Yeah. We just talked about we had our first live event in New York City, and the two speakers that were there talking about the important issues of crisis and change, particularly
was the topic of the evening, crisis,
religion and spirituality, have rejoined us. We've come full circle 5 years later to talk about how, well, we're still on the precipice of crisis or in mid-crisis, and a lot has changed. So our guests, we have Maria Francesca French is here, who's a post-Christian thinker and author, and is now associate pastor at
First Christian Church, Hagerstown, Maryland.
That's right. Yeah. Although, she also, it's like from New York, but then also lives in the UK and is married, and then is in Hagerstown. So she's international.
Yes.
She's global.
You're global, Maria. Welcome. And then who else do we have?
John Thatamanil is here, our friend, theologian and author and professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, author of Circling the Elephant, Comparative Theology of Religious Diversity, Tillich scholar, and and just all around like one of the great resources for religious diversity.
Indeed, I'm laughing only. I have to totally inject why I laugh, because of John, who I saw at Theology Beer Camp, up on stage with it was a cage match between the Tillichians and I guess really kind of the who was also Tom Ord, of course, talking about open relational theologies. Yes, and it was powerful to see that, but that's why I laughed to that. So welcome, John and Maria. So Maria, also, I think we should give a shout, because you have a couple of books that you've written yourself as well. So what are the titles?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning those. Safer Than the Known Way, and then Reconfiguring. And they're both written from a post-Christian perspective. The first one gives kind of a 30,000-foot look at what I'm defining the post-Christian conversation, which is kind of like a primer on radical theology, new faith imaginations, a little bit about Jacques Derrida and where this concept of deconstruction comes from, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit today. And then Reconfiguring is about when we get down into the weeds of that 30,000-foot look and what it looks like in various categories of life and faith and what it means to be human. It's fine enough to talk about these things at an ivory tower, hypothetical, theoretical level, but what does it look like on the ground? So those are the books that are out. Yeah.
Awesome. So to start off our conversation, first, welcome to our 100th episode. It's great to celebrate this with you. For both of you, can you just give us a little bit of an update? I mean, 5 years, the last 5 years have been like 100 years. There are so many things that we never anticipated. Can you tell us a little bit about what, some of the changes or some of the events along your journey over the last few years since we talked last?
I'll let my esteemed colleague answer first if he's happy to do so. John?
I'm happy to do so. Well, it's been a momentous 5 years. I have become ordained as an Anglican priest now, and so have a fundamentally deeper, I think, relationship with Eucharistic life, which in the midst of my religious multiplicity is a lovely gift. So I don't think I've become less multiple in terms of my interest in and commitment to learning from other religious traditions, but the intimacy with the sacramental has been a real gift. So yeah, and I think exactly 5 years ago was when Circling the Elephant came. I don't crank the books out like my dear colleague here does. So I'm still working on my next one. But the ordination is probably the biggest identity shift or change or marker. Yeah. So not much else to report. I mean, professional life, I'm enjoying life at Union. But pastoring communities and learning to, preach regularly has been a tremendous gift.
It's interesting because I think some of our lay listeners or people who are as church don't really think about the fact that like not every minister is a theologian and not every theologian is a minister, and that like preaching and teaching and working on theology and working on liturgy, like those are all different roles and different jobs and don't always overlap. So that's interesting that you've got those different roles and are able to balance them.
Yeah, I think the work now will be a kind of deeper integration of my life as a theologian, academic, and priest. It's not like I stop being either of these when I'm in the other role, and so letting both of those dimensions of my life meet each other more fully is I think a welcome task.
So, and Maria, you found yourself back in ministerial role as well. I know that you've undergone lots of other changes, but
yeah, which is funny because I didn't really see it on the horizon, but that's in so much of my life. These things just happen so fast, and it's almost like a signpost to me when things are moving fast and it happens in a blink of an eye. I know I need to be. It's sort of the trigger moment of like, this must be for you, because it's unexpected and it's happening in half a second. Yeah, so I am ordained also. I'm ordained with Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and I was doing ministry at the time of my ordination, and then when I moved to UK and married my husband is when I started doing all the writing, because I had so much time, because I just wasn't doing full-time ministry the way that I was. And when I say full-time ministry, I wasn't in a local church parish. I was working with regional denominations. I was doing education with pastors and nonprofit leaders. I mean, that's how I know you guys from doing that work. So I never really I never really had an idea or imagination for myself at a local church level. But over the past few years, I've been getting calls from several churches throughout the U.S. who had read my books and who had found my work. And, I'm sure we'll talk about this too, obviously the decline in church and church interest and growth in the last 15 years or so, although it is kind of getting a bit more, it's getting a bit more steady now. It's sort of finding its footing. The decline is slowing down. But it was in serious decline for a while. And so, they'll read or hear of someone like me doing this kind of work that's post-Christian as a person of faith, and what that all means. And they're very interested in what that might look like in church and what it might look like manifested in community. And I'm very interested in that as well. But I always knew, if I'm leaving, if I'm rerouting my husband and myself back into America, if I'm leaving England, if I'm leaving Europe and the UK and all that goes with that, it's got to be the right context and the right ministry, because I'm just so not a good fit for most ministries, and most churches and ministries aren't a good fit for me. So when this church
that's probably a wonderful thing, Maria.
yeah, it could be, but it was just like, I've worked with enough struggling pastors and struggling ministers to know I don't want to be one. I don't want fighting the uphill battle the whole time. I just don't have to. Like, it's not something I have to do. So why would I do that? If I'm going to take a position like that, I want it to be a joy. I want it to be a beautiful challenge. I want to be in good relationship with my colleagues and other staff members. And so when this church came calling in July, I talked with the pastor first. I thought, we're going to be a good fit together. And then one thing led to another, and I was moved here by mid-October. So.
Wow.
Yeah. But like you said, so many changes. I got married in 2020. I moved to England in 2020. I had my first publications come out in 2021. I published 2 books in 2023. I've published a few other chapters in anthologies, both sort of popular audience and academic alike. So yeah, I've had a lot of stuff going on, but it's been fun.
So it's interesting that that both of you also have spent time this over this period crossing borders, that you're both kind of international. I know, John, that you're preaching in Canada. And how has how have those perspectives influenced how you did the world over the last 5 years? I mean, there have been so many changes politically and socially going on in the United States, and you've been able to probably been privileged to perspectives on from inside and outside U.S. borders.
Well, I'd dearly like to hear what Maria has to say and whether it resonates with what I've experienced. My own sense is that the core problems that both polities encounter are the same. They're aggravated by aggressive neoliberalism, the desperate situation of property prices escalating at rates that no one can afford, the way in which that increases homelessness in both Victoria and New York, the sense of isolation and the crisis of loneliness that seems to mark people in both contexts. All of these core problems seem very akin. Of course, the aggravation of white Christian nationalism in the U.S. is unprecedented. Right? It doesn't have a match here.
Mm-hmm.
And here there's also greater attention to issues of indigeneity, the First Nations people, and in the last 5 years, I suspect you all know that the bodies of children have been found on the grounds of church schools, the
Mm-hmm.
residential schools. And that has accelerated, though not enough, the need to reckon with that issue. So that's been a very key issue in Canada in ways that, thanks to the presence of Deb Haaland as Interior Secretary in the U.S., this has sort of started to get going, in the United States too. But unfortunately, we're going to completely ignore that issue now. So it's astonishing how much resonance there is, even if the inflections are particular. White Christian nationalism isn't a driving force, but whiteness certainly is in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So these are some of the perspectives that you get. You see, well, the core fundamental issues are related to a kind of immiseration and growing gap between the wealthy and everybody else, the elite wealthy and everybody else, and the starving of resources from the public, and the attenuation of any sense that we're in anything together. A sense of common belonging in common public spaces and care for cities and communities. All of that is thinning out everywhere. So yeah, this may be why I can pretty much preach the same sermons in both contexts, often on the same Sunday, one in person and one by Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that should be plenty to get us started.
Oh. Maria, you want to weigh in on?
Yeah, John was right. That was plenty to get us started. That's amazing that you can talk about so much of that off the top of your head, and so much tragic, of course, in what you just said. And I'm sure we all echo and agree. Something that sticks out to me as just being on the other side of the pond for these years. So I believe it was in 17 or 18 that the UK appointed a minister of loneliness in government. And they figured out somehow that about 9 million people in the UK were often lonely or always lonely. And this was showing up in really real and tangible ways. Of course, there's, the suicide rates, and there's studies done on, depression and all of this. But they appointed this minister of loneliness, and which is such an interesting title for like a government official to
It
hold.
sounds like an 80s goth band or something, like
Oh, it's just wild. But essentially, 20 million pounds have been allocated to these efforts that include, community programming, support groups, um, community activities, and just considering the epidemic, because that's what they're calling it, an epidemic of loneliness in the UK when developing and writing new public policy. I mean, you kind of can't make it up. It's just sort of, and especially in a place like the UK where it's sort of like keep calm and carry on, and everybody keeps their emotions and their feelings quite close. Everybody's sarcastic about everything, and you can't really get at people's feelings. It's that cold British upper lip. It's real. That stiff upper lip. So I found that really interesting. And I also think from a faith perspective and like a state of affairs of the church perspective, I think you've had two major things happen in the last 5 years. And of course, COVID-19 was a big one. Most churches weren't ready for that. Where churches were struggling, this just decimated them. Some churches were already online and nominally and sort of ready to deal a little bit and up their game there. And most churches just scrambled to get online, which meant that it wasn't a really good experience for the user. I know our church, even though I've just arrived here mid-October, we have a large congregation, and we have not recovered from people who left during COVID and never came back. They kind of liked their online experience, or they just sort of backed away altogether. Because COVID-19 pulled back the veil on so much, systemic racism, how the government acts in crisis in our world, so many things. And it really caused people to question their meaning-making mechanisms and how they find meaning in life, which of course points to God and society, points to Western Christianity and church, and says, is this doing the job? Is God doing the job, or has God just sort of silently vaporized somewhere in the background? So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is the deconstruction movement, which I'm sure both John and myself have a lot to say about. Yeah.
One of the things that we were talking about, what COVID unveiled, is the differences in what people will regard as true. I was just reading a piece yesterday in the New York Times that was profiling a group of men who had voted for Donald Trump, and there was one question where they were talking about, like, where do you get your news? And the list of the motley hodgepodge, like people blogging in their pajamas and far right extreme websites, and that they were getting their news from, or one guy that was like, oh, I just get X all day, and that's where I get my intel. Even just the fact they talk about this intel. But it was so amazing during the COVID epidemic, the widely different ideas that people had about what was true. That there were certain people who were like, the CDC says this and the scientists say this, and other people are, no, it's all a big conspiracy and it can't be that. This such and such says this other thing, and you should use this folk remedy. When we talk about something like spirituality, already you're a step removed from evidence that you can measure in the lab. When people can't agree on what's true, how do we even have a common conversation about anything?
Yeah, Kelly. That is a very, very perceptive question, and I'm glad that you're contributing not just as an asker of questions, but really a perceptive social critic of our times. Yeah, I'm writing a book on post-truth right now, precisely because of this very issue. I think the whole indexing of identity to particular claims, like if you want to belong to our group, you will hold that certain things are true.
Mhm.
And if a question is asked about those convictions, it's not a question about the status of those convictions, but it's a question, indeed, and even an attack on the identity that's wedded around that conviction, right? So that particular configuration of a whole community whose identity hinges on believing certain things.
Mhm.
I mean, these are deeply religious issues, right? Whether they're called religious or not, they're playing out in profoundly, these weird identitarian ways, right? So if you belong to the right, you have to disbelieve that vaccines work.
Right?
I mean,
Yes.
like,
It's a litmus test. You must do this in order to be that.
you're right. And we can all come up with a list of these sort of identitarian knowledge claims, right? The knowledge claims are not to be assessed by any sort of empirical standards, but it's a question of belonging, right? To belong, you must believe X or Y. So we know what this is like in religious congregations, but now it's this sort of weird, political configuration of these beliefs. So it's a deeply problematic situation, especially if it's accelerated by the president, And one of the things we have to name is that I think that, Lancet and other studies suggested that our incoming president probably was responsible for about 400,000 excess deaths, right? That 400,000 more people died in the US. That's just genocidal numbers, right? And then we reelected him. So, it's a dispiriting situation because of the sort of epistemological crisis. That's, by the way, not my phrase. Obama used that phrase
Mhm.
in a very important interview talking about this. Like, how can I get anything done if people say, "Oh, those pictures of glaciers melting are fake"? Like, visual evidence is disbelieved, right? So, and here, of course, we see that if you deny what is true, there are grave consequences. So at least for some of us, a certain kind of caricature of postmodernism as a kind of relativism without any kind of mooring, which I don't think it ever was, is perhaps checked because we're like, if you just reject empirical evidence altogether, it's not that you have a knowledge problem. You have a reality problem. Like, people
Mhm.
die, right? So this has to be really thought, and this is a religious issue. It is a spiritual issue. And Kelly, thank you for naming it as significant. Of course, heck, I could talk about it forever because I'm writing a book, So
Maria, can you weigh in on this as well? Your reality, how you see post-truth?
Yeah, I mean, whenever I hear questions about truth, in my mind, always echoes Pontius Pilate's question to Christ, in a very
Yes.
sarcastic way,
Kind of
what
like-
is truth?
What is
And it's, when I read those words, it's, it's almost like, out of, a side breath out of his mouth. It wasn't actually a real question to Jesus. It was sort of a rhetorical one to himself, what is truth? Like, oh, there's so many truth claims flying around my head these days, so many, messianic claims or, magicians or claims here or claims there. Well, what is actually truth? You talk of truth, but what is truth? And so, it's sort of the question of like, what is faith? And I get asked that question a lot. And people want a very modern categorical answer. But faith is always changing. And so for me, my answer is probably always disappointing to people. because faith for me has just always been a moving target. It has always been about like what allows me to lean most into the integrity of what I feel faith is without compromise. And so that looks different throughout my life in various faith expressions of Christianity that I've been a part of. And I may have said this on an earlier podcast because I use this quote a lot, but for me, because faith is such a big question, and, you know, for me as a radical theologian, like all of life is theological. It's not just this category of life. You know, and so for me, I always think of a quote by, 20th century theologian Schubert Ogden, where he defines faith as saying that it's simply living like life is worth the living of it. And so for me,
Gorgeous.
I'm really happy with that definition of faith. And I think that can also, if we use our imaginations a bit, potentially be applied to that what is truth question. You know, it's leaning into life and really living and acting like it's worth living. And so when you use that hermeneutical lens on things like climate change, it really changes the game, and I think it changes the discussion. You know, and I agree with John when he quoted Obama about the epistemological crisis. I think we're in a hermeneutical crisis as well. People don't know how to interpret things anymore, and that's partly because people don't realize they are interpreting. We're sort of
Yes.
fallen back into this modern way of this or that situation when everything is so nuanced. There's not just one singular narrative, but there's a multiplicity of narrative understandings. And you can say that, across the board about so many things. So, I think the thing that's driving us, pushing us back towards modernity, pushing us back towards there's right and there's wrong and there's truth or there's not, and it's the reason why Trump got elected again, is just fear. People are so afraid and they want to be on the side of strength because it's the only thing that their life has taught them that can help them from being afraid and sort of protect them in some way.
Yes.
And yeah, I was just going to say, so like, who's done a bad job there? Like, who's done a bad job at holding these people who are afraid? Well, us, the people who follow the man who said, fear not.
That's putting your finger on it, and you're right. I say this not as a
Wow.
theologian or being somebody from your point of view, as ordained, but as a follower, and how, we're not here to tear the church down, but yeah, this is an opportunity from my point of view that church as we know it, reclaiming our faith as we know it. There's this need, not an opportunity, but it's a need to reclaim and speak profoundly about what it is to be Christian and what this means. This fear not that it's so pervasive that the institutions as they are currently, or the majority of which, only know how to use the people in pews. It's almost like a self-created scenario, right? That you must, and part of it also, quite bluntly, is the piece of shit doctrine. You're born of original sin, so therefore you're a piece of shit unless you give that all up and give your life over to Christ, and and do all these things to born again. And for me, that feels icky for my own personal. I wasn't born of original sin. I was not born broken. I mean, what has happened through me in the course of life? This is my own beliefs, of course, but still, nonetheless, I was born whole. I was born as a child of God. I am a spiritual being. I have a human experience. If you lean in on that, if I do, there are all these. I was whole and then got broken. I was broken by institution. Fortunate that I have made the journey to where and I have lived in the state of wholeness. I have this deep faith, but it took a lot of work and it certainly has, by me reassembling a faith that resonates with me in the ways that resonate and reaffirm my wholeness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just to add to that, and I'm highly biased by the faith that I grew up in and continually work with and against. as I go on my theological journey. But I think that the inwardness of the theologies that have been embraced so much in the United States have impacted our politics, in that I believe that there are a lot of people who are just kind of like hunkering down and trying to avoid sin, avoid going to hell until all of this gets blown up. That Jesus is going to come and destroy everything, and then everything will be good, without thinking about the fact that, if we read the Gospels, that the kingdom of God has already started. It's here. It's now. It's in the universe that we live. We're already living in it and should be exemplifying the values of it in this world. And it's much more outward. I read it as a much more outward facing gospel than one that's just like, let's just insulate ourselves. And our way of loving others is to at least try to restrict their behavior so maybe they won't go to hell either, rather than this kind of embracing love and charity and these works of, taking care of the poor and the weak and the outcast, by which it says the nations will be judged. It seems like a lot of that is getting missed. So this whole kind of, let's just build a fortress around ourselves and protect ourselves until everything eventually blows up, I see it reflected in all these different political and societal decisions.
I think, again, Kelly and Mark, you guys are deep. It's nice to be interviewed by people who just get your brain firing. And also, of course, Maria is just being brilliant. So just a couple of thoughts. There's a difference, as I was listening to you, between an inwardness that's solipsistic and an inwardness that is a cultivation to enter back into fuller relation. And the latter is deeply to be cultivated. The former is avoidance, that never actually succeeds, because the kind of privatistic attempt to sort of retreat is always already shaped by various ideological and political commitments. And because we're fundamentally social beings, we'll want to belong to collectivities. But if the inner work that you're doing is not fertile, not rooted in compassion, you're going to be claimed by a desire to belong. And that desire to belong that is on public offer. Belong to whiteness is the most compelling offer of belonging, right? And if our economic lives are driving us into constant work and isolation, and the minister of loneliness thing, and we have this sort of deep-rooted longing to belong, and the cheapest form of belonging on offer is an appeal to identitarian belonging, yes, you're going to eat that all up because you can't tell the true from the false. And so, and by the way, I just wanted to weigh in on, I got to talk personally to the good Vivek, our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, and he too has declared that we ought to treat loneliness as a public health crisis. And so I got to thank him in person at the White House for his efforts in naming and writing and almost crusading to have this recognized as a real issue. So yeah, under those conditions of loneliness, if there are no communities, if churches are thinning out, I mean, Robert Putnam was saying this quite a while ago when, in his book, Bowling Alone, that American civil life is sort of evaporating. So when people don't have things to belong to, including churches dying out, then, oh my God, the situation, potential false belongings that are cheaply offered, and what's a cheap belonging? A cheap belonging is one that says that in order to belong to X, you must have animus against Y, right? It's like a belonging that is defined by its opposition and exclusion. it's if you buy that poison pill, you can belong to us. So that kind of belonging is flourishing.
Such a brilliant observation. It's so spot on. So I'm going to challenge both of you to a question. Not looking for the ultimate answer, but is this not the opportunity, though, for church communities of faith to step into this vacuum, do it in a way that resonates, that doesn't involve, dare I say, doctrine or dogma, but just simply being sacred spaces where people can come back in to community? Because, there's such a bias against church for all the things that happened. I think people are scared of the buildings themselves and see all of the hypocrisy and the other things all of the things that they contributed to the decline of institution. Is there not an opportunity here?
Yeah. So that is a super complicated question. Even the way the question is phrased, is there an opportunity?
True. Okay.
it
Yes. Use your
sounds-
language.
Well, and I'm not saying that you meant to use angling language. But it's like when there is a crisis, the church steps up and go, okay, how can we get involved and like be the church? And I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but in general, the church tends to react rather than be proactive, which would be preferable. I think that if the church is willing to write in pencil and not in ink, they may have a bit of a say in the future. I also think that, I really struggle because in 21st century Western church, I should say we now, right? But we are so desperate to be relevant in culture and to survive somehow. And I challenge congregations in the work that I do. And even when I teach here, I go, what makes us distinctively Christian? What actually makes us a Jesus community? Because a lot of the things that churches do can easily be done by humanitarian groups, can be done by nonprofit organizations, can be done by any manner of, secular groups. I don't like to use the secular versus spiritual divide, but you know what I mean when I say that. And so for me, it's like, what does it look like to kind of cut through some of this tragedy and nonsense and chaos with a spirit of being a Jesus community without being alienating, without being hateful, without being isolating, all those things that people hate about church. Being that loving, justice-seeking, merciful ethos that can hold space and hold safe space, and also representing the trajectory of our Judeo-Christian narrative as we bring it forward in the future, and ask, what does this narrative have to offer this situation fresh and anew? And I think that's a really hard question to answer. I think it's hard to ask because once we ask it, we have to start imagining what the answer might be. And that's going to look different for every single community and congregation that attempts to do something like that. I think part of the reason why we are in decline is not only because, Kelly, you talk from like an evangelical charismatic standpoint, and I understand because to an extent I grew up like that as well. People are leaving evangelical fundamental circles because they don't like the original sin and the hell and damnation and all the, ideological ridiculousness. People are leaving main lines because it's all like a wet noodle. Like Jesus is a granola eating hippie, and there's really nothing exciting about him. Not that we have to make Jesus be more sexy than he is, but there's stuff there that we're missing that they just didn't. In the first century. And again, we can't go back 2,000 years and be there ourselves, but you know what I mean? Like coming to the text and just saying, okay, what else here is there? What am I missing here? What does this still have to say to a community? One of my favorite things is to preach and teach out of biblical narratives that have usually been taught ad nauseum. Anywhere in the world, people can recognize the story, doesn't matter who they are. and to potentially bring something new to the fore, or at least ask a curious question about it that maybe people around me haven't asked before. So I think part of it is just imagination, and really be willing to take this idea of kenosis, this self-emptying of everything we are and value and everything we've hold so dear about our identities and our sacred cows. We're really good at being like, change and what the people need, but not these sacred cows, not these things here. So it's a huge question. I think it's something that definitely is not going to happen overnight. And I don't mean that to be a cop-out at all. These are just my thrown at you about it, but
I certainly didn't ask the question looking for a quick response to it, because I think to your very point, it is a complicated question, and it is the couch of an opportunity. It is, again, it's out of necessity, because as you just mentioned, when you look at it from I am a follower of Jesus, and I finished Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited.
Excellent.
I'm glad I read it. And he talks about the religion, and that's where I just didn't have language. That's what I connected. I don't need the institution or the doctrine of the dogma that I participated in an institution that has it. The point is that I lean in what would Jesus do, not in the cliche bracelet, what would Jesus do kind of thing. What did he do? And I align my life and how I'm going to live that based on. And so in that comes the truth and conversations that I think that are often missed, to your point, Maria. And those are the things that are alive in it. And honestly, is it okay to leave behind the doctrine and the dogma and reflect at that? And you mentioned the first century, before there was institution as well. And what is it? That feels enlivening.
yeah. And I will add this though, because I'm in part of a lot of conversations that's like, this idea of like getting back to the basics. And this is how Jesus would have been originally interpreted. And this is how he would have been originally heard. And I hate those. It's like, guys, that's not a conversation we're having. It's impossible. You're 21st century, like Western white, modern, like, please, like, stop giving yourself airs as if you can look straight into the gospel and objectively see Jesus for exactly who he was and who he's, thank you for doing that. So, I'm not saying it's quite that easy either.
No.
I'm saying it is like a gorgeous, curious, imaginative, lifelong pursuit of having faith that the pursuit is worth the pursuit just for pursuing it, for pursuing's sake. I don't know, John, what are some of your thoughts? Oh, sorry, Kelly, were you going to?
I was just going to hearken to, it reminds me of something we were talking with Star Thomas a couple of weeks ago. And she was, and she was like, if you're not out doing the work of Jesus, what are you here for? Mm-hmm. It was just like,
it was a very blunt question.
So challenging. Like, why, how dare I simply get up in the morning and go to work? Because there's so much to be done. And it was really like, set me on fire a little bit. Like, there is a lot of work to be done, and you go back and read the Gospels, and you can even see it in some of the writings of Paul. I know that people often lean on Paul for sacrifice and salvation and stuff, but he talks about like what you're supposed to be doing. Like, you're not just supposed to be sitting here believing. There's work to be done as well.
Well, and I mean, if you want to get really simple about it, as John the Baptist was preparing the way for Jesus to come onto the scene, fruit of vipers, this, that, the other thing, he's critiquing everybody, and they don't fight back. They're just like, whoa, okay, what do we do? And he's like, if you've got 2 cloaks, sell one and give, or not sell one, this capitalist America talking.
So the decent part,
give one away. If you've got 2 cloaks, give one away. You can start there. Like, the idea of salvation in the Gospels is quite simple. So yeah, that's just when you're saying about, should I even be going to work? Well, yeah. But it's, these little things that bring about all of, we dream of.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Radical Love Live, hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson. Recorded at the Bravery Studios in Garfield, New Jersey. All rights reserved. Find our episodes on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. And check us out at radicallovelive.com, along with our personal websites at markdilcom.com and kellywilson.com. This is Radical Love Live, where we explore faith outside the boxes.
If you've ever deconstructed your faith, you know it's not easy. But just imagine if you could have people to guide you through your process. People like Jim Palmer, Kristen Dumais, Jennifer Knapp, Brad Jerzak, Brian Zand, Paul Young, and more. Well, if you head over to www.choiracademy.com and register for Square 2 using the promo code RAD, you'll get 10% off the regular registration cost of this awesome course and community just for being a fan of our show.
Embark on a journey to the heart of an isolated and restrictive island where secrets simmer beneath the surface. In Brandon Andrus's What Can't Be Hidden, follow Thura as she uncovers the dark truths of Patrida, navigating through betrayal and redemption. This tale of courage, love, and the quest for freedom will captivate you from the very first page. Get What Can't Be Hidden available now from Choir Publishing.
This Choircast podcast is brought to you by my book, Unless a Seed Falls to the Ground, Welcoming the Death of the Whiteness Gospel. I wrote this story as a plea for white Christian America to enter into a season of hospice spirituality, to recover from the cancerous lie that we can start over, be in charge, and recover some original purity of Christianity. One friend calls it a love story to the church, the United States, and the entire human family. It's available now on Amazon.
Are you ready to embrace a deeper, more intentional way of living? Introducing Deep Calls to Deep, Meditations for Your Spiritual Journey, Volume 1 by Brandon Andrus. Deep Calls to Deep offers a 1.5 years of weekly meditations to inspire spiritual growth and guide you toward a more meaningful, embodied life. Order your copy today wherever books are sold and begin your journey into greater connection and purpose. Deep Calls to Deep. Let your soul awaken.